Recently, I gave a talk on insulin resistance and weight regain at the Weight Loss Surgery Conference in Hamilton. It's been requested that I put this online for the people that couldn't attend. I had just been talking to a group of surgeons at the Obesity Surgery Society of Australia and New Zealand, and the impression I got from the surgeons is that they tend to think of obesity as being a chronic disease of the body, in other words, physiology. They therefore tend to think in terms of, yes, it's a disease. We fix diseases with surgery or medication, and if the disease isn't fixed, we try again with another surgery or further medication. But we can't actually help everybody. At the Hamilton conference, there was the wonderful Connie and Carrie who talked much more on the psychology of what's going on, in other words, the heart and the mind. And they're very aware that we eat because we have an emotional dependence on food. They therefore look at treating the dependency and understanding that the weight will be lost. There is a tendency, therefore, to think that surgery isn't necessary. I sit in the middle between the two and say both have an element of truth, except that physiology affects psychology and psychology affects physiology, and the best results we're going to get are if we understand both of these things. Now, surgeons tend to look at the whole thing as a set of pathways in the brain and the body and totally ignore the fact that as humans we actually have a lot of thought input into what's going on. The whole question of addiction, therefore, is irrelevant to them, and yet I know that almost all my female patients know that they've got a food addiction. Most of the men wouldn't acknowledge they had a food addiction, but they do say that I can't stop myself doing what I am doing, and therefore I actually need some surgical help, which actually probably amounts to I've got an addiction. There are criteria by which you can define addiction, and you only need 3 out of 7 criteria, and all of my patients would fit the criteria for food addiction. Now, the interesting thing is that when we do a bypass, a sleeve, or a band, patients do end up with their addiction being almost gone or better controlled, and it almost seems magical. So I do want to go into this as well as dealing with the insulin resistance side of things. Now, if we look at the brain, the blue area here is meant to indicate the fear center, and the fear center sits at the bottom of that curved part of the brain that is the hippocampus, and that is chock full of your memories of what happened in the past. You don't have fear until something's happened and you remember it, and then you worry that it could happen again or that you might not get what you got last time. The green area is the pleasure center. Now, as most of my patients will know, I've already said that when that pleasure center is stimulated by what does it for you, it releases nice chemicals, and those chemicals feed back on the brain and say, that is nice. Now, that fear center that we have is setting us up for worry, frustration, and it tends to drag the nice chemicals out of the brain. So the brain is then able to use the substances that stimulate the pleasure center to balance out that negativity that comes from the fear center and create a more stable brain. Now, the problem with that is that you can get an over-the-top response, or you can become too dependent on it. And you may become too dependent because things are too nice, or it may be that you've got a far too overactive fear center and you spend all your time worrying and you need to actually be activating the pleasure center, because otherwise you would get so depressed you would kill yourself, and that has no survival advantage for the species. So the over-the-top response creates a situation where it's set up to become dependent on a particular substance. And obviously for my patients, it seems to be, from all the evidence, that it is food that breaks down rapidly to glucose or that has a high fat content, but preferably both. To balance that, there is a part of the brain, and this is the red area, that we'll call the control center. The control center is meant to be telling us there will be consequences for what we do. So it's meant to keep us socially, physically, and intellectually safe. The problem is that, again, in my patients, if we actually look at this control center, we can see that when it comes to food, it actually is not working very well. So the net result is, if you've got an overactive fear center, an overactive compensatory pleasure center, and an underactive control center, you are set up for addiction, and if it happens to be food, you're set up for obesity. Now, this is not as straightforward as it sounds, and it can be also looked at in terms of different types of overeaters. The different types are impulsive, and this is related to the control center not actually reining things in and people just going with their impulses. Compulsive is more likely to be, I need to have this because I'm getting too much pleasure from it, and if I don't have that pleasure, my life is not good enough. Mixed is a mixture of both, obviously. The sad overeater is someone who gets depressed. In other words, the chemicals in their brain are not being produced properly, their mood goes down, and they find that they can boost it up by eating. The anxious eater is the person with the overactive fear center who is living on the verge of panic a lot of the time, but does find that food soothes that down. At the conference, one of my patients then asked, "Can you be all of these?" There was a laugh that went around the room, but I suspect a lot of people would agree I do seem to have elements of all of this. So we'll come back to this problem later, and I'm now going to go on to talk about insulin resistance, but what I want to make clear is that you've got to have the underlying brain thing going on to then activate the genes that set you up for insulin resistance. If you don't have the overactivity in the brain, you should be able to control the insulin resistance yourself. So insulin resistance, will tell you what it actually is. It's a pet phrase at the moment that's going around, and I want to explain it to you so that you understand the danger of the foods that you are tempted to eat. First of all, you've got to have the genes to become insulin resistant. You can't just develop it without the genes. However, those genes don't set you up for it unless they are activated by the environment, and that means by too much food that is got sugar in it or is high in fat, but is creating a need for insulin. Now, it's really interesting that we temporarily reverse insulin resistance by doing a gastric bypass, and this occurs within days. The problem is, however, that it's only temporary, and that to stay permanently out of insulin resistance, you actually have to keep the weight off and keep on avoiding simple carbohydrates. Now, let me explain what insulin resistance is about. Now, my fat cells and muscle cells and liver cells do what you all wish yours would do. The yellow thing here is meant to be my fat cell. So I eat my food and I digest it, it gets absorbed and taken up in the bloodstream. My fat cells take it up, and then an hour later, when all the food's gone from the gut, the fat cells can release it, and that can then cause the fat cell to reduce down in size. At the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the year, my fat cells remain the same size. Now, what's going on here actually is that there are receptors on the fat cell membrane, and these are important and interact together. So the first thing is I eat my sugar, but it can't get straight into the fat cell. It actually needs the sugar transporter to actively take the sugar up and put it into the cell. To do that, we need an insulin molecule to come along and open up there, and then the sugar molecule can go into the cell. But that doesn't happen in isolation, because when insulin's around, it means there's plenty of sugar around. There is also a negative effect on the part of the fat cell that exports the fat, i.e. that breaks it down and sends it out as energy into the bloodstream. And so that gets switched off. And so whilst the insulin is hanging around, fat isn't exported. But in my case, after an hour, all the insulin's back down to a normal level and my fat cells can export. Now, for my patients, it's a totally different matter. Now they are eating their food and the fat cells are taking it up, but when the food's all gone, and I would normally be releasing, it's like there's a blockage and people can't get the fat out of their cells. This has a number of effects. The first is that it actually makes us think in the brain that there isn't any energy around, and is therefore going to make us hungry 2 hours after we've eaten. The other thing is that it does seem to demotivate us if the energy isn't available, and makes it very unlikely that we'll be able to get off the couch and actually do some exercise. So what's happening at the cellular level is that, again, the sugar's available, but because there is something now wrong with the insulin receptors, it can't just activate with one molecule. It needs a whole lot of molecules to actually get the effect. So then it does open up the sugar transporter and the sugar can go into the cells. But the problem is it has a very prolonged, profound effect on the exporting of fat. And it means that for much of the time, that fat exporting is switched off, which means that the cells are making fat and getting bigger and bigger, but they can't get it out with all this insulin around. So another way of looking at it is, here's a graph showing what happens around my breakfast time. So what's happening is that I eat my breakfast, my sugar levels rise, but go back to normal pretty rapidly. And that's accompanied by a rise in insulin that also puts the sugar into the cells and blocks the fat breakdown, but after an hour it's gone and it's back to normal. Unfortunately, for anyone who's got insulin resistance, they're first of all having a similar glucose level as long as there's enough insulin around, but they're running with these hugely high levels of insulin, and basically they're blocked off for most of the time, which means it's incredibly hard to lose weight if you are insulin resistant and you are trying to actually keep your blood sugar levels up. Your brain is telling you you're hungry, so as long as you're eating anything with sugar in it, you can't lose fat. So taking these two things of the food addiction and the insulin resistance, I then came up with the way I think we end up with obesity. So the first thing is that as a child, we find out that for us, when we eat certain foods, we get a release of nice chemicals. We then start to develop fears, and we start to develop a brain that starts to look for endorphins because of the fears. We then create, in some people, these addiction pathways. The net result is that we start to accumulate the excess fat. we keep on getting more of the sugar in, and we then trigger these epigenetic release of the insulin resistance in people that are susceptible, and we then create a new set of physiological and psychological interacting processes that create a new high fat level that is then vigorously defended by the body and is almost impossible to beat on its own without any sort of surgery. So let's look at what we're actually trying to achieve with the surgery. And what we're very aware of is that these people that are coming for surgery have got a very big pleasure center. And what we find is that when we do the operation, we somehow seem to shrink down that pleasure from food in a way that isn't particularly disturbing, but is actually almost relieving. At the same time, we also seem to grow that control center a bit, and people are able, because they're motivated, because they're not overly hungry, to stick to the rules for at least a few months. So what goes wrong? A number of things go wrong. The first is that over a year, if you've had a gastric bypass or a sleeve gastrectomy, you can end up with the body adapting to the new physiology, and things start to go back to normal. Unfortunately, the insulin resistance can return, but it's only going to cause weight regain if we go back to eating the old foods again. And remember that you can, like any other addict, reactivate the addiction. So eating more frequently, snacking, especially on carbs, is a danger. Drinking alcohol is a danger, or having an injury and stopping exercising. So the problem with the alcohol is, particularly after a gastric bypass or a sleeve gastrectomy, is that it gets absorbed a whole lot more rapidly. Now, we tell all our patients, you are at risk of becoming an alcoholic. Everyone doesn't want to become an alcoholic, and so they say, all right, I'm only going to drink half a glass of wine. The problem is, one of the most potent things for switching off the control center is alcohol. And so when you've had your half glass of wine, you actually shrink down the control center, and it's usually going to be in a place where there's a lot of nice food available, and therefore you're also going to have a growth in the effect of the pleasure center. And that's why people will find that when they have the wine, they either get drunk or they find they eat more of the cheese and crackers and things that they wouldn't normally have eaten, and actually don't get round to eating the good food. So that is the danger of alcohol in the whole weight regain process, separate from the alcoholism side of things. So the way that we try and get around this with our patients, first up, is education. So when patients come through our system, we're trying to show them how they've been set up. We also try to explain why the concept of addiction is helpful in terms of realizing that I have a life that is going to set me up to try and go back to what I always did, unless I make some changes. The third thing we try and address is, well, what does the actual operation do versus what do I have to do on my own? In other words, what we can't achieve with the surgery. And we also explain how to use the tool. So where does that lead us at this point in time, where we are coming along perhaps with weight regain and finding that we are at that stage where the bodies adapt and it seems to be easier? So the first thing is to accept that you've got a brain whose main job is to keep you in a safe place. And it has been doing that for years, and you can thank it for that and say, you know, that's kept me reasonably sane, it's kept me on track, with life in general, but I want to do something different. I want to do things better. Unfortunately, the brain has set up a whole neural network of superhighways based on using food to keep my brain safe. So that means I've actually got to do some active work and do some changing. And the roadworks is something that we've got to do for ourselves. No one else can do it for us. So there's several ways that we can do that. The first thing is, how can we improve the control center function of the brain? And so what we're wanting to do is improve the bit of the brain that says there'll be consequences, so I better not do that. The first thing that has been shown clinically to do that is exercise. Now, a lot of my patients are frustrated with exercise because they used exercise to try and lose weight in the past, and they actually didn't lose the weight because they would go to the gym, but then they'd reward themselves by eating more food, and the net result was that there was an improvement in fitness, but actually no improvement in weight loss. We're not worried about exercise for that. What we're looking for is the fact that there is evidence that exercise improves mood and is actually as good as some of the antidepressants at getting people out of depression. The second thing is that it improves brain power. People actually get smarter when they exercise, particularly in that first hour after you've done the exercise, because it actually is going to improve blood flow to the brain, but particularly the part of the brain where memories are formed. So if you're doing any new learning behavior, the time to be doing it is straight after you've done your exercise. The third thing is that it enhances ego strength. Now, ego strength is your allotment of power that you have each day that actually can be used to make you do things in self-discipline. And it's like we get given this allotment. So back in the days when you were dieting, you could diet and lose weight as long as you used all your ego strength to fight food. But the problem was, as soon as there came problems at work or with family or with partner or stresses like parents being unwell, that took some of the ego strength, and you'd run out about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you'd be back off your diet again. The other thing that it helps with is decrease in impulsivity, and we think this is because people are actually doing a discipline when they do the exercise, and anything that grows discipline gives you the ability to control your behaviors better. The other thing it does is improves resilience. In other words, you're able to bounce back quicker when you've been exercising regularly, and you seem to get a soothing effect on that fear center. So all of these things seem to be improving the control center function in a way that is going to be helpful. Now, the other thing that you can do that's going to improve it is mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is a technique whereby we are able to get into our own brains and watch what we're thinking. And this is particularly useful for people with overactive fear centers. Now, it has some other effects as well, because you learn when you do mindfulness meditation to damp down the fear center. You decrease your cortisol response, your fight and flight response, and therefore you can actually improve your immunity. Again, it seems to grow the ego strength and give you a greater reserve of ability to cope. The other thing it does, particularly for people that may find it difficult to focus or have ADHD, is it improves focus. This, in turn, makes it easier to stay on track, and it decreases impulsivity, and again, it improves resilience. But the most useful thing is learning the techniques via the mindfulness meditation to soothe the control center and actually the to get into the healthier way of living whereby you can actually enjoy life. Now, obviously, the keenest proponent of mindfulness meditation is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who we had the pleasure of hearing talk when we were at a conference in India. So what is mindfulness meditation? It's moving apart from the busyness of the world in our brains and learning to sit back and observe and choose how we think. It's being in the present moment. It's being aware of what is coming in through our eyes, through our ears, through our noses, through taste. You can actually mindfully eat. It's being aware of what is around us, who is around us, and the enjoyment of the world that we live in. And in New Zealand, we have a fantastic world. It's also about getting back in touch with our bodies when we do the body scan part of it. And that is something that all my patients have lost. They're out of touch with the idea of fullness in the stomach. They're out of touch with eating mindfully. They're out of touch with where their body is at. And they often have some rather strange perceptions of what they look like. It's learning breathing. And breathing has been used for thousands of years by the Buddhists, but we're now very aware that it has physiological effects when it is done in certain ways that again help to switch off that fight-flight response. And we learn to see our thoughts as what they are, thoughts, not real world, not the real life, but just thoughts, fears, worries. And we learn to see our feelings, our emotions, as just that, feelings, an indicator that things may not be right or are right in our brains. But it is also realizing that we can control our feelings. Our feelings may be lying to us. We don't have to respond a certain way just because our feelings say that we should. The next thing is addressing the need for endorphins, and this is something that people often forget. We had a patient at a support group recently who said, "Hello, I've lost 40 kilograms in the last 4 months. I've given up smoking. I've given up drinking. I've given up eating. Life sucks." And it's the realization that we actually do need enjoyments in life, and just losing weight doesn't automatically give us enough endorphins to make life exciting. And so that's where we need to bring in various other strategies. When we're on that road to the operation, I encourage my patients to visualize what things are going to be like in the future. And this time it's going to be real. It's not just a dream. It is what will happen. The next thing is you've actually got to have reasons to actually lose the weight. I keep telling people that when I first met my business mentor, he said to me, "Okay, what do you want out of life? And how do you want your business to help you to achieve that?" That really made me sit down and think. And I would turn it around to you guys and say, what do I want out of life? And how will being thinner help me achieve that? Then the thing is to actually start setting the goals of the smaller dress size, the getting into the kayak, the being able to do the dancing lessons, and then actually doing them, ticking them off, and setting the next goal. One of the psychologists I work with really enjoys my patients, but he said one of the problems is that they don't know where they're heading, and so they don't go anywhere. So goal setting is important. Support is important. There is nothing as helpful as getting with like-minded people and hearing how they are doing and what they have found that has helped in the situation that you're now in. And that's why support groups can be so good. We need to be challenged. It's very easy to think, well, I can do this and get away with it. But again, support groups are good for challenging and saying, well, yeah, you might be getting away with it at the moment, but is it serving you well? The other thing about challenge is that when you are challenged and you achieve, it feels really good. We've got to get over the fears because we will fail sometimes, but if we always live in our fear center, we're not going to achieve. Gratitude has also been shown to be a very useful way to keep people on track, and I encourage my patients to look at where they are now versus where they were before the surgery, feel their body, realize what they could do yesterday that they hadn't been doing a year ago, and then just to be grateful to God, the universe, the husband, the bank manager, the surgeon, whoever, because that attitude of gratitude makes it easier to keep on track each day. Realistic expectations are a good way to actually stay grateful. Unrealistic expectations are a very good way to get depressed. And it's always worth discussing with your surgeon if you think your weight loss isn't going as it should, because he'll probably be able to reassure you that this is normal and, if necessary, give you some hints about how to get back on track. And the last thing that often gets ignored is one of the most healthy things we can do is laugh and play. Play means doing something just for the joy of doing it. It's got no useful purpose. And that doesn't mean watching TV. It means getting out and using this new body that you have for some reason. And it can be playing with grandchildren or kids. It can be playing a sport. It can be just running around for no particular reason, or it could be running for a particular reason. Okay, the next thing that's very useful is the concept of discipline. A number of people have said, I just need to change this. I just need some more self-discipline. And I would say, well, yes, you do. Where are you going to get it? Well, I just need more. Yes, but where are you going to get it? And the simple answer is, there is no place that you can buy self-discipline. The only way to get self-discipline is to create it by doing. And so we're very aware that if we were to leave people to their own devices, they would have good intentions, but they wouldn't necessarily do it. So the best way is to use other discipline until you've actually got self-discipline yourself. So the other discipline is to give people permission to keep in touch and bug you. And you can do it with texts. We do it with emails. We send people emails once a month and remind them that we are here. You can do it with phone calls. Accountability partners are especially valuable if you're both on the same track, and a little bit of competition is good. Exercise partners are essential if you're one of the more normal people that doesn't want to get out of bed and exercise. So actually being able to say to someone, I give you permission to get me up out of bed and make me come rain or shine for a walk, and we'll meet at this time, is a very good thing. Finally, failure management. It's never a case of being perfect all the time. It's always a case of we will make errors. Our brain will just take us back to what we always did. The most important thing here is to realize it's going to happen and to be able to use that mindful detachment to actually look at what the mistake was and figure out, is this what I want to be doing? Is this serving me? And then looking for strategies out of it. And this is where the accountability and support are especially useful. So the other thing that we're very aware of is that you can reactivate via memories, your desire for foods and things again. And changing your behaviors, changing the places where you go, the people you meet up with, and the things that you do is really the only way around that. until you get strong enough to be in those places without being tempted to get back into it. I mean, the classic one would be the person who says, I can't have coffee without a cake, especially when I meet with Jane. So in that case, we've really got to be saying, maybe I won't meet with Jane until I've actually got this under control. When we do start having to go into new situations, it's always good to plan at the office party what I'm going to do, what I'm going to eat, and when people try to make me do something else, to have a script ready for what I'm going to say to make it possible. So with all of the strategies and things that we've talked, I want to make it really clear, I don't blame any of you for being where you are. I don't blame you for being there for a long time. I don't blame you when your brain tries to take you back there. But what I do want to say is that we as human beings have worked best when we get together as a group and don't try and do it on our own. And by far the best way is to get the support, to join up with people, to go to support groups, make your own support groups. And there's plenty of help online, particularly from Post-Op and a Doc, Connie and Carrie. If we try and do it on our own, we are going to encounter the struggle for survival. What we've got to learn, though, is rather that we need to learn the snuggle for survival. Further to this idea of changing the playground, it is worth mentioning that a lot of research has been done on how to make you eat more food. And so there's a chap called Brian Wansink who wrote a book called Mindless Eating. And he's found that we eat more if we are watching TV or movies. We're eating more when we're cold, and restaurants know that when they freeze you out. They also lower the lighting, and that tends to make us eat more. You eat faster if the music's faster, you eat slower, and so restaurants can actually figure out how to make you eat more if they want a rapid turnaround, or eat slower if they want you there to stay all evening and spend more money. Interestingly, if you are feeding people chicken wings and you keep taking the bones away, they will eat more than if they can see the pile of bones building up in front of them. The other thing that makes us eat more is if we've eaten insulin-stimulating food, and the classic one is the bread you get given when you go into the restaurant, which will make you rapidly hungrier. The other thing is that if they bring you your drinks rapidly, that will also, as I mentioned earlier, switch off the control center and make you much more likely to order the dessert that you intended to not have. And the last thing is that the greater choice we have, the more we will eat. And in that case, they did studies with Smarties, and if people had however many they wanted, but only had one color, they ate far less than if there was an assortment of colors. So putting all this together, it is the awareness that this is what we are at. This is where we are with our brains at the moment. Wherever we are in relation to surgery, it is what it is. So accept it and then say, well, it is what it is, but is it how I want it to be? And if it isn't, we've got to work at it. And working at it means learning the stuff like you've just learned in the talk, learning from the mistakes, setting up new, different goals, and constantly asking for help. When you do make a mistake, it's a matter of not saying, what the hell, but instead it is doing the next right thing. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope it's given you some stimulation to get back to your support group surgeon or get more help online from whoever, and look forward to seeing you at the next weight loss surgery meeting.